Well, good afternoon and welcome to this webinar brought to you by NQA. My name's Richard Walsh and I'm NQA's Principal Assessor for Environment and Energy. Say hello to everybody. Recognise a few names on the delegate list looking down. So a few people that I've met before, few people who I know have sat in on some of my webinars before. If you have, nice to see you back. And if you haven't, I'll just go through a number of housekeeping things before we get too far down the road. I think, I just want to make sure. There we go. So, first of all, we've already had the question once from one keen member of the gang who's joined us this afternoon. You will get copies of the slides, first and foremost, so you will be sent, probably next week now because it's Friday afternoon, you will get sent copies of the slides, so you don't need to frantically scribble down everything that I'm saying. You will also get a link to our YouTube page. We have a channel on YouTube where this and all other webinars that we deliver as NQA, we record them all. And they're all posted there for you to listen. So if you've got a boring afternoon or you're struggling to sleep at night, sit and listen to one of our webinars, and that'll send you off. But seriously, we do record all our webinars. So not only do you get the slides, you also get a copy of the webinar, so you can listen again if you decide you wish to, or you want to find anything else that we've done. So I've done loads and loads of other webinars on transitions, 14,001, 50,001, integrated management standards. There's all sorts of different ones we've done webinars on, as well as things on quality and health and safety and all sorts. So I think that's it. If anybody has any questions, if you want to type them into the question box as we go along. So say we've already had one that was asked if were we going to get copies of the slides, and yes you are. Hi, there are a couple of people saying hello to me. That's good, thank you. Hello back. So what we're going to do this afternoon, Friday afternoon, I'll try and keep it light because it's possibly not the most engaging of subjects, although when I ran this webinar a few months ago, some of the feedback I got was that you made it quite interesting. So I shall try and do the same again. So what we're going to look at is what are known as interpretations, definitive interpretations with regard to 14,001/2015. I wish other technical committees did this. They might be doing it, and if anybody knows different, let me know. Yeah, if somebody's lost sound, that's probably at your end, I'm guessing. Can somebody else let me know whether they can still hear me? I guess you all can, because nobody else is jumping up and down saying we can't get any sound. Previous webinars, yes, are on our YouTube channel. If you've gone to YouTube, look on the bit that says channels and search for NQA, you'll find all our stuff on there. Thank you. Everybody's telling me now. I'm getting swamped by people saying they can hear me. So I'm sorry, whoever that was. You've now got mixed up in a whole pile of lots of people now throwing things at me saying loud and clear, etc. Right, I'll bat on. So what happens is we're going to look at the technical committee. We're going to look at who TC 207, Technical Committee 207, SC1 actually are. We're going to look at what the interpretation process is, what it means, why are they there, what's it all about. We're going to have a look at some of the key interpretations and also then how we can all keep in touch, both with the interpretation process and also allow you to ask some questions at the end. As regards questions, if you want to ask questions as we're going along, I'm happy for you to do that. However, if you suddenly think of a question that was a slide sort of half an hour ago, then I might try and come back to that at the end. So that's where we're at. So what we're going to try and look at is make sure that we understand the ISO committee structure, look at the review process. We're going to look today at 22 different interpretations. There are more than that. And that link's important, and as I say, it's in the you'll get the slides. If you click on that link, it takes you to the full list of interpretations. Now, the 22 we're looking at today are the latest batch that have just been released. On the PDF document, there's the previous year's interpretations as well. I did a presentation like this last year. Every year, I tend to pull out the interpretations and do a little session like this, talking through them, because some of them are interesting. Some of them you think, why on earth did you need to ask that question? It's so obvious. But some of them actually are quite useful, and it's all about identifying what the intent was when the authors actually wrote a particular clause or a particular phrase within the standards. So in other words, what did you actually mean when you said we have to do this? Because actually our assessors viewed it one way, our consultants viewed it another way, we're stuck in the middle. Can you tell us what you actually meant, because we need some help? So the full list is there. If you want to click on that at some point, please don't do it now, but the full list is there. So TC 207, Technical Committee 207, sometimes known as the Travel Club, because they move all around the world. They've met in all sorts of wonderful places. They've met in Bali and the Seychelles. Sadly, I don't get to go on ones like that. I've been to one meeting of TC 207, and that was in Birmingham. So there you go. I don't get to go to any of the glorious overseas sites. So who are they? Technical Committee 207, it's the ISO subcommittee with responsible for 14,001 and other supporting standards. So that 14,001 family of standards, or the 14,000 family of standards. And they've got a work program. You and I have got work programs. They've got work programs as well. And they're focusing at the moment on 4 key components. So that's the overall understanding of 14,004 and keeping that up to date, and making sure that 14,004 is updated and published. There's some associated standards coming out, evaluating consequences of environmental aspects, 14,002/1, policy and organizational elements, ISO 14,006 and 14,009, they're work in progress, I believe. I don't think those are out yet. And then one that I've not particularly looked at, but I know is important to some people, evaluating strategic and monetary consequences, 14,007 and 14,008. So they're the sort of things that they're actually involved in, taken from their own website. They have a website. If you ever want to know what's going on with all these guys that write this stuff that we all have to try and work to, tells you a little bit about. So all the stuff on there is the sort of stuff that they're actually working on just at the moment, all around 14,001, all around this concept of environmental management. Everything in there sort of fits in with all the cogs whirring away, but at the heart of it all is 14,001, which is and will remain to be the key core standard, if you like, for how businesses manage environment. Now, so what is the interpretation process? So as I've said, it's all about you or anybody saying, we've got a difference of opinion here. Can we get a definitive meaning to a particular phrase within the standard? And initially, in this country, you asked BSI, not BSI certification. I wouldn't promote them. Apologies if you're with BSI, but no, we're NQA. But BSI standards. So BSI standards, who manage and publish standards within the UK, they are the UK body who would take things on to the technical committee. You can't just email a technical committee yourself. So first of all, you would speak to BSI, and they might be able to answer that at the first stage, because they do keep a dialogue up with TC 207, and they may have an answer already. But all requests received and all formal responses given by ISO member bodies are included in this annual compilation of interpretations. And it's published once a year. A lot of people don't know it's there. They don't seem to shout about it. So what I do, I just think it's a nice, interesting thing to have a look at. I find it incredibly interesting, but that's the sad person I am. I find it incredibly interesting to look through these, because part of my role within NQA as our principal assessor for energy and environment is to train and upskill all our other auditors. So I also run a seminar like this, or a session like this, for all our assessors, to make sure that they are in tune with what ISO's latest thinking is in terms of what this actually means. So the committee is asked to consider all information received, and if any interpretation varies from the formulated position, then they give an explanation about why they might have changed their mind, why they might have decided that something is slightly different. And as I say, this annual compilation is made available. It's publicly available, and it's free of charge. I just don't understand why nobody else decides to do what I do, because I think it's interesting. I think it's nice to actually have a look at what goes on behind the scenes and sort out some of this stuff that we have to work with. And ultimately, it helps us all improve our processes, both yourselves as clients, if you like, of certification bodies, but also us as well as trying to get some consistency across all our different auditors. Because one of the big issues we find, and I know I won't mention his name, but there's one of my clients on here at the moment who's just transferred into NQA, and one of their biggest concerns from their previous certification body, who I won't mention, was a wildly varying difference between assessors. Not just sort of wavering a foot either side the centre line, but swinging from something being completely correct one year to being a major non-conformance the next year. And that's part of my role to make sure that doesn't happen with an NQA. And it's things like this that allow me to make sure that we're doing that. Right, the next sort of, what time are we on? 2:15. So the next at least half an hour, probably 40 minutes, is going to be, other than the questions at the end, is going to be now 22 slides looking at all of these interpretations. So the way I do it is I start off by asking the question, which is in red, and then the next bit underneath is the interpretation. Roger, no, I'm not sure that it does happen to other standards. I've looked for my other standard, which is 50,001, and I can't get an answer on that one at all. So I think it's something that only TC207 do. I don't know why it doesn't happen to other standards. I think it ought to do. I nearly swore then. I just think it ought to do, because it's such a valid and valuable process. Anyway, so no, it doesn't happen to the other standards, as I'm aware. If anybody does come across it, because I've looked, if anybody does find it, let me know, please, because it gives me another opportunity for some more webinars. Right, so number one, where to draw the borderline between legal requirements on the protection of the natural environment and those protecting occupational health and safety issues has been raised by a CB as a non-conformance for not including health and safety legislation. So this is a question around a legal register, and they've had a non-conformance for not including health and safety legislation in their 14,001 legal register. Now, the answer, which you see in green, is that, quite rightly, all organisations are obliged to comply with all applicable legislation. The standard says so. And it says, 14,001 actually says that the organisation shall determine and have access to the compliance obligations related to its environmental aspects. So my view is, if there's no environmental aspects that can be linked to legal requirements concerning health and safety, then they don't have to be included. Now, my take on this, it is acceptable to include other obligations. You know, if you've got a legal register for 14, even though you might not have 45,001, if you've got a legal register, why not include other stuff? Why not? You know, that's what it's there for. But it's not a non-conformance. It would be if you had one register covering 14 and 45, but you weren't including any health and safety legislation, but you were using that to demonstrate compliance with health and safety legislation, yes, an issue. But if you've only got ISO 14001 in place and nothing else, and you've only included environmental legislation in there, then that is absolutely, oh, thank you. So it does appear for 9001. Thank you, Richard. That's me a bit of reading over the weekend. Okay, so it is obviously acceptable to include other obligations, but it's not a requirement. And I think the feeling there is that that would be a non-conformance that had been issued incorrectly. And of course, we, as all certification bodies do, have an appeals process. And if you don't agree with the finding, say so. And if the assessor won't back down, then you can go through their appeals process. But just to summarise, a 14,001 legal register does not have to include other legislation that doesn't relate to environmental aspects. Next one. In some places in the standard, the organisation is directed to take certain items into account, while in other places, the organisation is directed to consider. Is there a difference? And yes, there is. Yes, there is, certainly there is. And in fact, I've had to break off. I apologise if I run out of voice by the end of this. I'm just in the middle of a training course I'm delivering to some of our internal staff on 50,001 assessing and the new 50,001 standard. And it's a question we've been talking about there. As an example, it talks about you have to consider something. So 14,001 uses the word consider and the phrase take into account with a specific intent. So where you see the word consider, it means it's necessary to think about the topic, but it can be excluded. So in other words, you've looked at it, you've considered it, but we're not going to include it. If it's take into account, you've got to think about it, but then do something with it. You can't exclude it. So if the standard uses consider, you have to demonstrate that you've considered it. You have to demonstrate you've looked at it. Be prepared for an assessor to say, I see you've not included that. I'm guessing you've considered it. Can you just talk me through your thought process there? Because to me, it perhaps ought to be in. I'd be interested to know why you've considered it and ruled it out. So that's a process. If it says take into account, we as an assessment body would expect to see that in there. That's a fairly straightforward one. Right, just on 9,001, I've got the question, would 9,001 require all legislation, i.e. as there are health, HR, equalities, finance act, environment, health and safety? In a way, yes, but 9,001 doesn't really require the setting up of a legal register. So you don't have, it doesn't say anywhere really that you have to have access. You could argue that it comes under understanding the needs and expectations of interested parties, because if there's a regulator, the regulator will be an interested party, and that interested party will be interested in whether you're complying or not. So 9,001 does it in a slightly different way. And 9,001 might ask you to take those things into account, whoever they might be, because ultimately, if you fail to comply with a piece of, say, as you say, HR legislation, or maybe health and safety legislation, or even information technology, GDPR is a good example, it could affect your ability as a business to continue running. So therefore, it is important, but it tends to do it in a different way. Right, section 3, terms and is section 3 terms and definitions binding? And if so, may an auditor determine whether appropriate environmental objectives have been set to meet the requirements of the definition in 3.2.6? Now, with my standard in front of me, 3.2.6 says, environmental objective is an objective set by the organisation consistent with its environmental policy. So the only sections of 14,001 that you're audited against are sections 4 to 10. Clauses 1, 2 and 3 are the non-auditable clauses. So that's the first thing. So you can't have an assessor throwing a non-conformance at you because of a definition in clause 3, unless your failure to comply with that definition or your interpretation of that definition has meant that you failed to comply with an actual clause of the standard. So if the objectives are consistent with your environmental policy and actually the development of them has taken into account significant environmental aspects and associated compliance obligations, then the objectives are consistent with the standard. So that's basically what the standard is saying, that if you look at the clause on objectives, then clearly you have to make sure that they are consistent with the policy. And that's in the standard. So the policy commits, of course, to continual improvement, commits to protection of the environment. So if you've made some additional policy commitments that you've not then followed through with objectives, then that might be a problem. But the non-conformance wouldn't be against 3.2.6, it would be against clause 6.2.1a, that your objectives are not fully consistent with your environmental policy. I hope that makes sense. That's a fairly easy one. Does 14,001 require an organisation to demonstrate that it has addressed requirements related to aspects, significant environmental aspects, policy commitments, context issues and concerns, risks, opportunities and compliance obligations individually for each subclause in 14,001? Or can an organisation demonstrate that it has addressed these collectively through the significant environmental aspects determination process? A long, long question with a shorter answer. I always think sometimes the shorter answers are the better ones. There is nothing in 14,001 that says you have to structure your management system in the same way that the standard is set out. So 14,001 does not mandate separate processes or procedures to be used for addressing its requirements, providing the requirements are addressed. How you address those requirements is entirely up to you. So you might, as it suggests there, have a single environmental planning process that covers a number of things in clauses 4 and 6, because if you remember, clause 4 is about context and needs of interested parties. The outcome of that moves across into 6.1, which is risks and opportunities, followed through into aspects, compliance obligations, and so on. There's quite a synergy between those two clauses, and they follow on. So there's nothing to stop you having one procedure that would cover context, interested parties, moving on into risks and opportunities, covering aspects and how you work them out, how you score them, how you work out what's significant, how that then follows through compliance obligations, through planning and into objectives and targets. You could have that as one complete environmental planning process. I have a couple of smaller clients who have a 9,001 system. They've got 14,001, but the 14,001 elements are in one procedure that covers that whole environmental planning process, and everything else is actually managed via the quality system. So quality system talks about monitoring and measurement. Quality system talks about internal audit, talks about management review. So the standard leaves you to run things exactly how you want to run them. So you don't have to have procedures to cover all the separate elements of the standard. If anybody tries to tell you should, tell them I said otherwise. Right. You will notice, by the way, that I've put these more or less in order that they pop up within the standard, with a couple of exceptions. So clauses 6.1.1 and 6.1.2, does 14,001 2015 allow an organisation to consider environmental risks and opportunities as environmental aspects, and those aspects that it intends to address as its significant aspects? So in other words, I go into a number of clients and I ask about risks and opportunities, and a little bit of a heads up here. Next week, I'm carrying out a gap analysis for somebody who's watching this seminar. So a little bit of a note here. I won't say who it is or where they're from. When I ask about risks and opportunities, don't just point me to your aspects register, because they're two separate clauses. There are risks and opportunities within any environmental system, within any environmental management of a company or an organisation, that are not directly related to aspects. Your aspects are things that you do that have an impact on the environment. There are other things happening around us. So for instance, Brexit. appears on a lot of people's risks and opportunities. For some people, it's a risk. For some people, it's an opportunity. It's an environmental opportunity for some people. It's an environmental risk for some people, but it's not directly related to their aspects. So you've got to show it somewhere. So you can't say that we're going, thank you. That person has just said noted. So thank you. So the answer is there is a relationship between an organization's significant aspects and the risks and opportunities. And the key word there is a relationship, but they can't be treated as identical. The definition of risks and opportunities is not the same as significant environmental aspects, certainly not. And they are separate things. Environmental aspects can result in risks and opportunities, of course they can, which can be determined as part of the significance evaluation. However, there might be other risks, which I've just talked about, that need to be addressed in the environmental management system that are not related to aspects, things that you raised back in the context phase. So in answer to the question, and there isn't a yes or no in this, but I think there is, the answer to the question is no. It doesn't allow an organisation to consider its environmental risks and opportunities as aspects. And if I come in and audit you, or one of our NQA assessors comes in and audits you and asks about risks and opportunities, and you've only got the aspects register to show them, you probably are going to be on a slippery slope to, I would guess, a minor non-conformance. This is a strange one. I often wonder why people have to ask this question. What is meant by the commitment to fulfill its compliance obligations in section 5.2D of the policy? So in other words, the standard says you've got to say that, so somebody's asking, what does it mean? Now, my view is, this is before I show the initial view is, if you've committed to do something, you're going to do it, and you've committed to do it. Whether it's a piece of legislation you're committed to meeting, or whether it's a voluntary obligation you've chosen to take up yourself. If you've committed to do something, then you're going to do it, and the system's there to make sure that you're going to do it. So quite why you need to, that sounds to me like somebody's trying to wriggle out. However, the relationship between 14,001 and regulatory compliance is addressed in a number of places within the standard, quite correct. The commitment is demonstrated through the management system process, the EMS process, and actions that the organisation establishes, implements and maintains. So the system itself will point you in the direction of ensuring compliance with your compliance obligations. The commitment to comply is reinforced by the requirement that top management periodically reviews the adequacy, suitability and effectiveness of the EMS in meeting its expected outcome. So in other words, it's for the system to make sure that you've got legislation in place, you're aware of it, and you're monitoring your compliance of it. Now, interestingly, and this is one that I've picked up a number of times, illegal compliance is not necessarily raised as an EMS non-conformity if, for example, it's identified and corrected by the EMS processes itself. So, for instance, if you are monitoring, say, your pH as part of your effluent flow, and you notice one Monday morning that actually over the weekend you've been discharging outside your consent, that is a technical legal compliance. Does it need to be raised as an EMS non-conformity? Maybe, maybe not. If you've identified it and it's been corrected already, then that's fine, because it's maybe part of the normal process flow. If it's been done by a problem, I don't know, that there's a piece of equipment failed and nobody noticed it, then maybe it does need to be picked up as a non-conformance. But if something's gone wrong and the system identifies it and corrects it, it's not an issue. It's same when we're auditing. If I notice that you've done something that's against a piece of legislation, you've identified it in an audit and corrected it, I won't raise that as a finding. I'll only raise it to find it if you've hidden it or you're not aware of it and I found it. Then that is going to be a problem. So I say to all my assessors, encourage your clients, and I say this to my clients as well, if you've done something wrong, if you've broken the law, tell me about it, tell me what's happened, tell me why it's happened, but more importantly, tell me what you've done to close it out and stop it happening again. If that's fine, you won't get penalised. If you sweep it under the mat and hope I don't notice, and the chances are I will, then you're going to get a major non-conformance. So it's best to be honest, best to be open, but commitment to fulfill its compliance obligations, that's what the standard is all about. Now, this next one, environmental policy states top management shall establish, implement, and maintain an environmental policy that within the defined of the scope of the EMS is, and there's various other bits. Does this mean that the policy statement must now include wording from the scope statement to link the operation of a location to the policy statement? So in other words, say the wording that you've got on your certificate from us, from NQA or whatever other certification body you're with, which is your sort of public element of the scope, or within the standard where you've actually got to document your scope, which is probably a little bit wordier than what's on your certificate. Do you have to put that on your certificate? Not on your certificate, start again. Do you have to put that in the scope, in the policy? Does the policy have to have the wording from your scope? No. The standard requires an organisation defines and documents the scope, and separately that top management establish, implement and maintain a policy. There is no requirement in 14,001 that an organisation includes specific wording from its scope statement within the policy. If you want to, you can, and I have some people that do that. And in some ways, it's quite a good way of getting your scope made available publicly. But there is no requirement to actually put the wording of the scope in your policy. It's a nice to, if you want to do it, but don't let anybody tell you that it's a requirement, because it isn't. It's quite acceptable then to ask, because it's not in your policy, how do you make the wording of the scope available if need be? How do you communicate that requirement? And that's perhaps a slightly different question. But in terms of the putting it in the policy, that's entirely up to you. 14,001 just says the scope should be maintained as documented information and available to interested parties, can be done separately. I think it's neater in the policy. That's my recommendation, but it's not a formal requirement, no. I think it's a nice way of doing it though. A lot of questions about the policy and various other things. In determining whether the environmental policy is appropriate to the purpose and context of the organisation, including the nature, scale and environmental impacts of its activities, products and services, is it relevant for an assessor to determine whether this policy covers all the management units within the organisation being audited? So this is now digging down into not just taking at face value what's in the scope, but actually looking about, does the policy cover all of the management units within the organisation being audited? Now that's almost getting into the same answer that we got previously, because that's back into the scope. So the assessor has to determine whether the policy is appropriate for all of the units within the scope and has been defined by the organisation. Once the scope's been defined, and it's defined elsewhere, possibly, or within the policy, all activities, products, services within its boundaries need to be included within those policy commitments. So in a way, the answer to this one is yes, that it's to make sure that you're not doing something in your scope that's not referenced or committed to within the policy. So in other words, I think that's somebody trying to wriggle out of an issue that their policy doesn't cover absolutely everything, and maybe they've left something out the scope in the hope that nobody might notice, but somebody's picked them up about the fact that, well, actually, you don't mention this process within your policy. Why is that, I wonder? So that I would say is a yes, the policy must be appropriate for everything that's within scope. Interesting one. Must a regulated environmental aspect automatically be considered a significant aspect? I won't ask for a show of hands. How many of you in your environmental aspect evaluation process say that if something has a legislative angle to it, by default, it's significant? I suspect if I could ask for a show of hands, quite a few of you would say yes, because I see it all the time, that irrespective of whatever else you might think about it, a number of people do actually, I can probably ask for a show of hands, but I won't bother. One of the things that we see a lot is that happening, but the standard itself actually says no. Basically, you can if you want, is the short answer. Section 612 requires an organisation to determine those aspects that have or can have a significant environmental impact. It doesn't tell you what that criteria has to be. All it says is you have to use established criteria. You decide. If you, absolutely, whoever's just answered that question, no, it isn't significant. It can be if you want it to be significant. If you decide that's how you're going to go forward, if you decide that your established criteria is that you're going to make them all significant, go ahead. That's not a problem. You can do that. But 14,001 doesn't demand it. 14,001 allows you to set your own criteria. And in A6.2, anything that says an A in front of it is the appendix at the back. That section on this states that the environmental criteria are the primary and minimum criteria for assessing environmental aspects. But it is the organisation that sets that criteria. So if you want to make it significant, it can, but the standard doesn't mandate it. It's entirely up to you. So in answer to the point that was made, no, it's not significant, that's not strictly true. It's significant if you want it to be. If you don't want it to be, it doesn't have to be. Oops, went the wrong way then. Okay, another interesting one. Is it permissible for small organisations to declare that they have no significant aspects and still be conformant to the 14,001 standard? I'd be interested to know what anybody's view on that was, actually. If anybody wants to, oh, hang on, we've got another question about copies of the presentation. We did mention that right at the start. Everybody that attends gets sent a copy of the presentation, don't worry. So Annika, you will get a copy of that sent probably next week now, because it's Friday afternoon where we are. You will get a copy of the, everybody gets, even people who actually who've registered and haven't attended, and we probably get, just looking at the list, with about 2/3 of the people who registered have actually turned up. So everybody that registered will get a copy of the presentation. So what do you think? Is it permissible for a small organisation to declare that they have no significant aspects and still conform to the standard? My answer is no, it's not possible. What the committee says is, although there's no explicit requirement that an organisation will identify one or more significant aspects, there's an underlying assumption that the organisation will do so. And basically what the intent is that an organisation considers significance in a way so that it can prioritise its actions. And it recognises that not all, recognising that not all aspects that it identifies require the same degree of management. So it's almost horses for courses. So if you've only got 10 people in your organisation, your most significant aspect won't have the same impact as something, a company that's got 10,000 employees. You won't even scratch the surface, but to you, it's still your most significant impact on the environment. So it's all relative. As I say at the bottom, significance is meant to be a relative term. What is significant for one organisation may not be for another. So my view is, although the standard doesn't say you can't, if I had a client who said to me, do you know what, Richard, we're so small, we've nothing significant, so actually we've not done anything on that, I think I would start to dig very, very deep with that organisation and ask them about their process, because I personally don't believe that that's possible. And I think the intention of the reply there is that the people, although they've not actually said no, I think they've sort of said that there is an assumption that the organisation will do so. Another interesting one, does section 613 compliance obligations require that the organisation must have its own direct knowledge of the environmental legal requirements that are applicable to its products in all countries into which they are exported, and not be able to rely on either a corporate entity which sells the product in a foreign country or an independent importer to which it ships the product? So in other words, if I'm sat in the UK now, if I'm selling my product to Brazil, for instance, do I need to have an in-depth knowledge about all relative Brazilian legislation pertinent to my product? Now, with regard to products, the standard doesn't specify geographic boundaries, nor how you determine and have access to the requirements. What it does say is you have to establish, implement, and maintain a process to meet those requirements in 612 to 614. So 612 is aspects, 613 is compliance obligations, 614 is planning action. So you don't have to have direct knowledge. However, you have to have a process as to how you will determine those requirements and have access to them. And that might depend on the level of control or influence that you've got as to how your product is used. So for instance, I might produce a product here that fully meets all UK requirements. Once it's shipped to Brazil in boxes and it's unpacked and put on the shelf, I've really no control over how people in Brazil use it or dispose of it. I can try and influence that by making it easy to recycle, by labeling and putting information in, but I can't actually control how that's happened. So therefore, what they're saying is it's about the process, and you don't have to have direct knowledge, but if you haven't got direct knowledge, you will need to convince your assessor, you will need to display somehow some knowledge of how you're going to ascertain that and ensure that you are abiding by it. So it's not necessarily a requirement. This sounded like somebody was trying to flog standards. Must an organisation have access to the 14001 standard either in hard copy via computer or by an external source if you're certified? It's an interesting one. So in other words, if I'm coming in to audit you, do you have to have a copy of the standard? I've got a copy of the standard, I'll have one with me. Do you, as somebody who's being audited, have to have a copy of the standard? So what the standard says and what the committee says is an organisation seeking to conform to 14001 must have access to information relating to the standard's requirements, including any subsequent revision, so that it can take these requirements into account in establishing, implementing and maintaining its EMS. That's a long way of saying yes. Basically, you need to have a copy of the standard available. Personally, I wouldn't be too bothered if it was a photocopy of a photocopy. I'm not in the business of selling standards, so therefore I wouldn't be too worried about that, but I would expect everybody to have access to a copy of the standard that I was coming in to audit them against. And that equally well applies to 9, 14, 45, and so on. Is the standard itself a compliance obligation under clause 613? And is it a document of external origin? So, how many of you, and again, I don't want a show of hands, but I want you to think about this. How many of you with 14001 in your compliance register under non-legislative obligations, so not the things that there's a piece of law against, under other, if you're going to use that terminology, how many people have got 14001 2015 listed as a requirement? Because you should have. 14001 is a compliance obligation and one that must be detailed under the standard. So yes, 14001 is a compliance obligation. 14001 defines compliance obligations to include requirements that an organisation has or chooses to comply with. So in other words, I would expect to see 14001 listed in your compliance register, along with 9001, 45001 and any other standards. And yes, also it is a document of external origin that you need to demonstrate you keep control of and you are aware of any updates. Although they only come around about once every 7 years or so, but even so, you do need to be aware of them. We do, thank you. Is it a non-conformance if an organisation establishes environmental objectives, but at the time of the audit, none relate to an identified significant aspect? Here's an interesting one. And this was what I was talking about a little bit earlier when we were talking about consider, because in 50001, under objectives, it says that you have to consider your significant energy uses, which is the same as the significant objectives. So in other words, do you have to have an environmental objective for every aspect, or what happens if you have one that doesn't relate to any? So in other words, you've got 5 significant aspects, but your objectives don't relate to any. Interestingly, the answer is no, you don't. It's not a non-conformance, whatever the assessor might tell you. Clause 621 says they have to be taken into account. Now, I think, if you remember, taking into account says you have to consider and then do something about it. Consider says that you can think about it and ignore it. So I think that they're slightly barking up the wrong tree with the answer here, because taking into account significant aspects means you've actually got to do something with them. But the answer they give is, should be taken into account when establishing and reviewing environmental objectives. It also requires that risks and opportunities are considered. So they're saying, is it a non-conformance? No, it's not a non-conformance, but I think it is, because actually you've taken into account, and another question says if you're taking something into account, you've actually got to act on it. What I would say is you don't need one for everyone. I think if a company has got 5 significant aspects and the objectives don't cover any, I think I'd have a problem. But the bottom bit probably answers it. Over time, given the required commitment to continual improvement, it would be expected that there would be one or more objectives related to one or more significant aspects. But actually, I think the no, which is taken from their answer, not mine, I think that's incorrect. Now, here we go. Would it be that there is an improvement plan but no objective? That's true. Yeah, you could have an improvement plan but not an objective. That would be acceptable. That's another way of doing it. Most people think you only have improvement plans alongside each objective, but I have seen improvement plans that don't directly relate to objectives. So that would be another way of doing it. Absolutely. Quite happy for it to be done that way. Right. Where are we now? Must objectives be set that are explicitly related to the organisation's commitment to environmental protection, including pollution prevention, or are the scope and content of objectives solely at the discretion of the organisation? So what this is saying, I think this is quite an interesting one. So it raises the issue that you can't read a particular sentence or section of the standard in isolation. So what they're saying, I think what's behind this here is that the policy commitment is that you commit to pollution prevention, environmental protection, including pollution protection. So therefore, do you have to have an objective that specifically relates to that? But no, you don't is the answer. And it's this interrelationship between all the different clauses of the standard that's actually important. So section 6.2, which is again environmental objectives, doesn't itself require that the documented objectives explicitly mention environmental protection or prevention of pollution, not at all. But it does require that the organisation take into account its significant aspects. Now, this is already going against the answer they gave in the previous question, if I'm being brutally honest. So they're all, we're all fallible at some point. So it does require you take into account its significant aspects and associated compliance obligations. And the compliance obligations and the significant aspects would relate, I'm sure, to pollution prevention and protection of the environment. So in answer, yes, you probably do have to, but you don't have to use those phrases as mentioned in the policy. Does 14,001 imply some consideration by the organisation of legal requirements for training of employees in establishing competence and training? Right, so this is all about, does legislation say you have to have people trained? Now, again, the answer is no. In 14,001 section 7.2, there is a requirement for the determination of training needs as part of competence, as part of the wider management system. And I fully understand that, fully accept that. However, there may be certain requirements that would come under compliance obligations would come under the needs of interested parties that require a formal type of training. So in environment, there's not a massive amount. There's some. There's loads in health and safety. If you want to drive a 360-degree excavator, you can't just jump in one and go merrily riding around the construction site. You've got to have a license for it. In 14,001 in environmental legislation, there's a few. If you're going to be running a permitted waste facility, you need to have a certain level of training and competence. If you're going to work spraying pesticides and herbicides, if you're going to be out with your knapsack sprayer on spraying weed killer or pesticide, there is a legal requirement that you are trained and you have a certificate of competence to do that. So that's all it's saying, that if the law says you have to be trained, yes, 14,001 says you have to be trained. Outside of that, it's up to you to decide what training you need in order to demonstrate that somebody can do the job. And that might be competence rather than training. Now, this is massively complicated. So, and this is why I've tried to do it in a number of questions, because this goes over a number of pages, but I think it's interesting. It's all about outsourced products. So bear with me on this one, please. Company A outsources part of their production, so let's say electroplating, to company B. So I'm running an engineering company and I'm outsourcing part of my production to another company, company B, who is carrying out the electroplating. Company B, who carry out this electroplating, are a totally separate company. They're in a different part of the country. Let's say we're in the UK. I apologise if anybody's overseas. We're in the UK, so they are 150 miles away. Don't know why I've not used somebody closer, but they're 150 miles away. So I stick them on the back of a lorry and they're driven 150 miles. Somebody plates them for me and then they bring them back. Is Company B, Threads Electroplating Limited, considered a person doing work under my control?
I don't know that one.
You might have heard that. I have one of those Amazon Alexa things on my desk and it thinks I've just asked it a question and it said it didn't know the answer to that one. I'm hoping I am going to give you the answer. That was quite interesting. So is Company B considered considered a person doing work under my control? If so, what does 14,001 require me to do regarding ensuring that Company B are competent? And what does 14,001 require me to do regarding identifying the training needs of Company B? So in other words, I'm an engineering company, I'm sending my parts 150 miles to a totally separate company, they're being electroplated and sent back. Do I have any responsibility for training and awareness and everything else? Long answer. In the example given in question A, in the question, Company A would need to determine whether there are any tasks being performed by people within Company B that are related to my environmental aspects and within my scope. Now, clearly, if they're 150 miles away and doing something that's nothing to do with me and they're just a subcontractor as far as I'm concerned, and I'm just paying them to do a job and they're electroplating my components and sending them back, they're not within my EMS scope. Really? Because it's a subcontract process. But if they were, then I'd have to implement some mechanism to make them aware of my particular EMS requirements related to those particular tasks. It's a bit of a grey area. So for instance, I might say, I don't want you to plate those in such a way that it causes problems for the end user. But that's more of a customer requirement, and that would be placed on them rather than, but I might say, for instance, I want to use returnable packaging. I want you to wrap them in this particular type of material to send them back to me. I want a returnable packaging that we can use, blah, blah, blah. But they are not really within my EMS scope. But Company A would also need to determine if there are any tasks that can affect my environmental performance or my ability to fulfill my compliance obligations or are related to emergency preparedness. Now, it's interesting because in the annex in section 8.1, there are some questions around outsourced processing, and it's one area that causes a lot of difficulty. An outsourced process is what we're talking about here. Has to be within the scope of my EMS, first of all. And in order for an outsourced process to be an outsourced process and comply with what the standard is saying here, or what the question is saying here, it has to fulfill all of this criteria. So it has to be within the scope of my EMS. So for instance, if my scope does not include electroplating, then it's not an outsourced process. If my scope talks about and the control of the subcontract electroplating process, then it does. Is the electroplating process integral to my functioning? Well, if my product wouldn't work if it's not electroplated, it probably would be. But again, it has to comply with all of these statements. Is that electroplating process needed for my EMS to achieve its intended outcome? Probably not. Is liability conforming to requirements retained by me? So in other words, if that electroplating company had a big environmental incident, one of the tanks split and there was a whole load of electrolyte went down the drain, is that my fault? Is that my responsibility? Clearly not. So that's not an issue. And finally, the organisation and the external provider have a relationship where the process is perceived as being carried out by me. So this doesn't happen very, very often. Now, here we go. Would it be that if there is an improvement plan, but no. What if electroplating is within the scope and the subcontractor is only used as an overflow? Can it be excluded if the scope is made clear that only in-house electroplating? I'm guessing that then, so I'm going to see the rest of the question. It goes off the bottom. Can it be excluded if the scope is made clear that only yes, you can, basically. It's for you to define the scope. And my answer would be try not to have this happen. The only time I've seen it happen where it's clear is one of my clients who's in the food industry has so many forklift trucks on site that they have a Lind engineer on site all the time. Well, not during night shift, but between sort of 7:30 and 5, they have a Lind engineer on site every day. He has his own little area, he has his own corner, and that is an outsourced process because it's somebody else who's working on their premises carrying out something that they need to have done. I came across it also years ago when I implemented as a consultant 14,001 at a power station. The power station that was run, all the maintenance on the power station, all of the lubrication was carried out by Castrol. Castrol had a facility within the power station boundaries, and Castrol employees came in on site and worked on site. We see this quite a bit now where there is another organisation working on your site. Now, if there was an incident that Castrol caused on that site, to the casual passerby, they would just think it was an incident from the power station. So that, to me, is where it tends to work. Where things are happening 150 miles away, it's probably not going to be an issue. I hope that answers that, but it's a perennial question, outsourced processes. Now, I apologise for going over. We've about another 3 or 4 to go through, so we are going to run on to about 3:10, something like that. The chap that I'm looking at next week says, "You're going to have fun with us!" Exclamation mark. We'll discuss that next week. We'll discuss that next week. And I'm sure we will. And I'm sure we will. I suspect you've got lots of outsourced processes. But it's an area that I know quite a bit about and how they're managed. Right. Clause 9.2. Is the intent of the requirement in 912 evaluation of compliance that only those working for or on behalf of the organisation conduct the evaluation of compliance, or can those evaluations include those conducted by regulatory authorities? So in other words, here's an example then. I have a number of clients that have an environment agency permit. As part of that environment agency permit, the environment agency come on site once or twice a year, dependent upon the risk, and carry out a legislative audit, but only against the requirements of the permit. So the answer is, the intent of clause 912 is that an organisation determines how it's going to periodically evaluate. and can choose to include evaluations conducted by staff, by consultants, and by regulatory authorities or agencies. So in other words, this regulatory compliance isn't just a one-off activity. I have people, for instance, who have a rich cocktail of things that feed into regulatory or compliance or evaluation. Their internal audits feed into it. They quite often have people, sort of foremen, who walk around the site. So one of my clients, the foreman, does a site walk once a week, walks around with a notepad and his camera, or his phone, should I say these days, and just walks around. Why is that on a bund? Or why is that not on a bund? Why is that dripping? What's that? You know, a bit of a housekeeping audit. They count. Because again, you're looking at risk, you're looking at management of risk, you're looking at compliance with legislation. The only thing that you can't count on is our audit. You can't count our audit as part of that process because we are doing a third-party assessment. But you can include customer audits, you can include regulatory audits, you can include consultants that you've paid a huge amount of money to come in and do a legal compliance audit. You can include all of them. But you can't rely on, say, an environment agency audit on its own. It can be part of a wider cocktail of evidence that goes into that review. Is there an expectation in 14,001 that all applicable compliance obligations will be assessed for all environmental media over the same time frame? Or are periodic compliance assessments on a sampling basis considered adequate? So in other words, do you have to cover everything every year? That's the question. 14,001 requires you evaluate compliance obligations. It doesn't specify a particular methodology, and it doesn't specify frequency. So periodic compliance assessments may satisfy if taken together, they cover all applicable compliance obligations over a period defined by the organisation. So in other words, if you say you're going to do it over 3 years, then do it over 3 years, but show and demonstrate you're doing it over 3 years, but demonstrate that you've taken the risk into account. So if you've got something that's a legal requirement that's really, really risky and the brown stuff will hit the fan if you get it wrong, and then you say to me, but actually, Richard, we only check it every 3 years, you're going to have some problems. But if it's something that's fairly minor and doesn't really, it's not going to cause a problem if you do breach it, then actually I might say, well, yeah, you're concentrating on the more important things. That's fine. And I'm happy that you look at that every other year. So basically what I'm saying is decide what you're going to check, when you're going to check it, how you're going to check it, and on what basis you're going to check it, and stick to it. But make sure that you can explain the rationale that was used in setting up that checking regime, if you like, and that rationale has to be based on risk. Final couple, 2 left. Does the standard require companies to select internal auditors who are certified, have a background in environmental management, or have previous work experience in the environmental field? This again sounds like somebody who's trying to flog auditor training to businesses. I apologise if there's any consultants out there. I'm going to take away your business. No, I'm not. 14,001 does not contain specific requirements on certification, education, or work experience for internal auditors or any other position. All the standards talks about is that you have to define competency. And that's what clause 7.2 says. And that competency can be on the basis of a whole load of things, but you have to determine that competency. So 14,001 is saying that you decide what education, training, or experience, including certification, is needed. So in other words, if you decide that all your internal auditors for 14,001 need to have been on a full 5-day lead auditor course, say it, but make sure it happens. If you feel that actually you're a smaller organisation, and you know what, it's not rocket science, a lot of this, and actually our 9,001 auditors can probably get by on this, then do that. Now, I judge this based on the results of the audit. I look at an audit, I sample an audit, I look at a number of audits that have been done, and I make a judgment. And do I think those audits are good? Have they got sufficient objective evidence? If we're going to start talking about training, I shouldn't be sat here talking to you. I don't have any environmental qualifications. As you might say in the beginning, I'm a full member of IEMA, I'm a chartered environmentalist. I'm a mechanical engineer and a metallurgist. I've no formal qualifications. I'm a lead auditor in quality, I'm a lead auditor in environment, I'm a lead auditor in energy, and I've got the certificates for that. But actually, I've no training in environment. It's competence. I've been doing this since 1994. So it's up to you. Again, don't let anybody tell you that they have to be. If you decide that that's what you need, that's fine. And then the final question. Does 14,001 Section 922 require that the organisation conducts its internal EMS audit on an annual basis, covering all elements, i.e. the full scope of the standard? Now, if you've just listened to the answer I gave a couple of questions ago about legislative checking, you're going to guess the answer here. No, it doesn't. The standard requires that you establish the frequency, not the standard. The standard doesn't tell you you have to decide what the frequency is. That frequency is not defined by the standard. So it's up to you whether you audit annually, yes or no. What the standard says is you've got to decide on the frequency based on the level of risk. So I have some clients that actually audit some areas every 6 months because it's such a high risk. They have other audits that they might do every 2 years. Also, it varies. One of the things I say to everybody is if you're having a problem in a particular area, so if one audit picks up a huge issue with an area, you might decide you're going to audit that area more often. One of the things you think about when you're putting together an internal audit plan is the risk of the area and the results of previous audits. So just in the same way that you might with quality, if you're checking incoming goods, you might have a heightened level of checking, a normal level of checking, and a lower level of checking. Do the same with auditing. If you have a lot of audits to get through, concentrate on the areas that are really, really vital and are a high risk and you've had problems in the past. And if you can justify it, maybe slacken off the frequency for the less, how shall I call it, less risky areas. It's for you to decide. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. The standard tells you what you've got to achieve, not how you've got to achieve it. That's probably going to be my message. That takes me to the end of where we are. Now, some of you know how to get hold of me, some of you maybe don't. I'm happy for anybody who's sat in on this to contact me. If you have any questions that pop up that you think, oh, crikey, I wish I'd asked him that question, send me an email, richard.walsh@nqa.com. We are going to email the presentation to you. We send it as a PDF file, not as a PowerPoint presentation. We send it out as a PDF file. You'll get that by the end of next week. Realistically, you'll probably get it Tuesday, maybe even Monday. Does anybody have any final questions whilst I'm just doing the wrapping up? Because I have a couple of things that I just want to thank you all for. So I'll waffle for a minute or two. Yeah, thanks, Alan. I will see you next week. That's fine. You've got a lot to do. I'll make a judgment on that next week. What I will say is, other than this one audit I've got to do next week, I'm actually on holiday for 3 weeks after today. Against my better judgment, I was persuaded to come back in and do a one-day gap analysis next Friday, but technically I'm on holiday for the next 3 weeks now. I will monitor emails, but if I don't reply, if you do send me a question, don't get frustrated if I don't reply for a couple of weeks. But no, thank you for attending. There is a question that's just popped up. What if a company has scheduled all its internal audit for a week after the NQA audit? That's fine. That's fine. That doesn't matter. You can schedule it the week after, because our process is an annual process. Your internal audit process is an annual process. If you want to schedule it for the week after we've been in, I don't have an issue with that. Okay, it means that the audits I'm looking at are 11 and a half months old or whatever when I come in next year, but that's fine. If that's what you decide you want to do that. But so long as you're going to schedule it and do them at that point in time, absolutely fine. You can do that if you want, Eamon. No problem at all. Any other questions? There's still 91 people on, as long as it's not an internal initial certificate. Right. Yeah. There is, I was assuming we were talking about ongoing audits here. If we're going through the stage 1 and the stage 2 process, yes, of course. Once you've had your stage 1 audit, between the stage 1 and the stage 2, there is an expectation that you've audited your entire system. Absolutely correct. So quite rightly. If the question that Eamon's just asked about you've scheduled all your audits after the week after the stage 2 audit, no, you're not going to get through there. But once we've continued on then with the surveillance visits, absolutely, you can do them when you like. I prefer them spread out through the year, but if you want to do them all the following week after we've been in, that's not a problem. But you're right, John, who's mentioned that you can't do it at a stage 2. You've got to do it between the stage 1 and the stage 2 visit. Any other questions? I need to get back to my other training course by 3:15 because I've got a couple of my auditors sat waiting for some more information on energy management. Is a manual compulsory 14,001? No, it isn't. There's no requirement for that at all. Basically, it's up to you. There used to be in the old standards, yes, you needed a manual. You don't need a manual in any standard now. What the standard says in section 7.5, documented information, it's up to you to have whatever you need to ensure that you have an effective system. So the organisation's management system shall include documented information determined by the organisation as being necessary for the effectiveness of the system. There's some areas where it says you must retain documented information, and that's a different issue. But in terms of a manual, if you want a manual, yes. If you don't want a manual, no. Don't let anybody tell you. There's too many consultants, there's too many assessors out there that are old school, expect to see a manual. When we went into the new standards in 2014, 2015, we all as assessors had training on how to audit a system with no documented manual. So no, it's not mandatory at all. Oh, thanks a lot, Jade. I didn't see you sneaking in there. No worries, thank you. I'll see you soon, I guess. Last call for questions. Last call for questions. People are saying thank you, so I'll wait another 30 seconds to see if anything arrives. If not, thank you for your time. Have a good weekend. I don't think the weather, certainly in the UK, is going to be as good as it has been for the last couple of days. Usual weekend thing. It's nice all week and then it's horrible at weekends. Thank you very much. Remember, keep in touch. If you want any questions, send me an email. Keep in touch. If you're an NQA client, definitely keep in touch. If you're not, still keep in touch. Right, all the best, and I'll see you again sometime. Cheers then. Thanks a lot, everybody. No more questions. See you later. Bye-bye.